Good evening and welcome to tonight's bibliotherapy session live. I'm going to be talking about The Promise by Damon Galgut, which won the Booker Prize 2021. And it is a rather deeply marvellous book, which I do very highly recommend that you read. I was planning to talk about all of the Booker Prize shortlist this evening, but I don't have all the books to hand, and I would like to tell you about them when I've got them and I can show you and share sections. So I'm going to share those ones later in the year. I'm going to probably do them over the next couple of weeks, not that we've got a lot of this year left. And I'd love to know if you've read any of those Booker Prize shortlisted books, and if you have, what did you think of them? And if you've read this one, did you love it or did you not? I actually did a session with my book group on this very book this morning, and not everyone loved it, though some did. The people that finished it did love it. That seemed to be the theme. And some people, I think, got slightly waylaid by the beginning and didn't get completely sucked in. But I must say, it's a book that's fantastic to listen to on audio, if that's an option for you, because the narrator reads it. He's a South African and he reads it in a really fabulous accent, which obviously goes with the book, which is written by a South African author. And the narrator does the voices absolutely brilliantly. And you'll see when we start talking about the book that it's a book that flows from one voice to another in a very beautiful way, because the narrative voice moves from one person to the next in a seamless way, occasionally going into the voice of a homeless person, into the voice of one of the key characters, into the voice of a bird even. So the voices are constantly changing and the author doesn't really give you any warning. And in some ways, I think it's a book that's possibly slightly harder to read than it is to listen to, because when you listen to it, the narrator makes a lot of the does a lot of the work for you by giving you the voices and flowing from each voice to the next. And I think it must have been a pretty incredible acting job for the narrator of the book, whose name I will tell you in a minute. So I'm going to just introduce you to Damon Galgut first, for people that don't know his work, and I'm sure lots of you do, hopefully. Do tell me if you're fans of Damon Galgut. I'd love to know. And if you've read any of his books, write me a little comment, send me a little wave if you've read any of his books. I'd love to know which and whether you like them. He was born in 1963 in Pretoria, South Africa, which is also where I was born, funnily enough. I was born in South Africa because my dad was a diplomat over there at the time, but I was only there until I was 2, and then we moved to Iran, but that's another story. His father came from a Jewish family and his mother converted to Judaism, and we do have a bit of that coming into the book because the mother in this book also converts to Judaism. At the age of 6, he was diagnosed with lymphoma. Galgut became head boy of Pretoria Boys High School, so he must have been someone who was good at leading and succeeding in life even then. And he then studied drama at the University of Cape Town. He wrote his first novel, which was called A Sinless Season, when he was only 17. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? And his next book was a collection of short stories called Small Circle of Beings, which included a novella called Small Circle of Beings, which describes a mother's struggle with her son's illness. And that's another theme that comes into this book. I think Damon Galgut does write often about mothers and sons. His novel, The Beautiful Screaming of Pigs, won the Central News Agency Literary Award in 1992. And his next novel, The Quarry, which he wrote in 1995, was made into a feature film, which was released in 1998. He's actually written a lot of plays as well in his lifetime. And this book is his 8th novel. His 5th novel was called The Good Doctor, published in 2003, and that novel was actually shortlisted for the Booker Prize. He's been shortlisted 3 times for the Booker Prize. So there was The Good Doctor, 2003, then there was In a Strange Room, which was 2010, and then finally there was this book, The Promise, which was shortlisted in 2021 and won. So surely Galgut must be pretty happy about that he has now won the Booker Prize. He is an interesting man in terms of his personal life because he's a very non-materialistic kind of man. He eschews TV and cars, and he's pretty obsessed with yoga. He also has a fetish for stationery, and apparently he writes his novels longhand, which is quite rare these days. The only other author I currently know who does that is Patrick Gale, but I bet there's probably others that we don't know about. Do reveal yourselves if you're on this session and you are someone that writes in longhand. I'd love to know. Apparently Galgut has actually used a particular tortoiseshell Parker fountain pen since he was about 20, and he must be now in his 50s because he was born in 1963. So that means he's used the same pen for 35 years. That's pretty amazing as well. So he's clearly a man of habit. And what else can I tell you about Galgut? He's also gay, and he has stated that this leads him to focus more on male-oriented relationships in his writing. Though in this book, I would not say that that's true. This is a book which is very much equally about men and women, and if anything, it focuses more on the women in the novel than the men. So The Promise, as I mentioned earlier, is Galgut's 8th novel, and this is a book which explores the complicated world of South African society and politics, particularly the legacy of apartheid. And I feel this book is very much all about the legacy of apartheid and how it affects not just the particular family that he focuses on, but its ripples are felt throughout the world. The Promise tells the story of a white family called the Swarts, who are descended from Dutch settlers who came to South Africa in the 17th century. The 3 Swart children come of age as the country undergoes the abolition of apartheid, a system, as we know, that formally segregated South Africans on the basis of race. Each of the novel's 4 parts revolves around one family member's death, tracing the Swart's decline. This novel is written in a style which is very much a flowing narrative with flowing narrative viewpoints, and it has many relationships to other postmodern novels, such as novels by Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, and the book As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner, which is all about an old man's funeral when his children are going towards his funeral, basically, or taking his body towards its final resting place, is a book which I feel very much is lurking in the background of this book, because this book has 4 funerals in it, and it's a book very much about death. Having said that, it's a book that's also full of life and humour. So when you if you were to describe the plot to someone, it would sound incredibly depressing. And that's something that when we were having our book club this morning, people were mentioning that it sounds like a pretty off-putting and depressing book if you just look at it from the outside at the events in it. However, when you actually read it, it's the way that Galgut writes which completely mesmerizes you and keeps you gripped, because he writes with an amazing clarity of vision. Various critics have said that when you read this novel. You feel more like you're actually there in the room with the people living that life than with any other novel written in recent history. It's amazingly vivid and incredibly tangible. And I'm going to read you a bit to give you a sense of that clarity of vision. I'm going to read you the very beginning of the book. I'm going to give you a few more sections from it later, but I do particularly love the beginning. The moment the metal box speaks her name, Amor knows it's happened. She's been in a tense, headachy mood all day, almost like she had a warning in a dream but can't remember what it is. Some sign or image just under the surface, trouble down below, fire underground. But when the words are said to her aloud, she doesn't believe them. She closes her eyes and shakes her head. No, no, it can't be true. What her aunt has just told her. Nobody is dead. It's a word, that's all. She looks at the word lying there on the desk like an insect on its back, with no explanation. This is Miss Starkey's office, where the voice over the tannoy told her to go. Amor has been waiting and waiting for this moment for so long, has imagined it so many times that it seems already like a fact. But now that the moment has really come, it feels far away and dreamy. It hasn't happened, not actually, and especially not to Ma, who will always, always be alive. I'm sorry, Miss Starkey says again, covering her big teeth behind thin, pressed-together lips. Some of the other girls say Miss Starkey is a lesbian, but it's hard to imagine her doing anything sexy with anyone. Or maybe she did once and has been permanently disgusted ever since. It's a sorrow we all have to bear, she adds in a serious voice, while Tanny Marina trembles and dabs at her eyes with a tissue, though she has always looked down on Ma and doesn't care at all that she's dead, even if she isn't. Her aunt goes downstairs with her and waits outside while Amor has to go back to the hostel to pack her suitcase. She's been living there for the past 7 months, waiting for what hasn't happened to happen. And every second of that time she's hated those long, cold rooms with their linoleum floors. But now that she has to leave, she doesn't want to go. All she wants to do is lie down on her bed and fall asleep and never, never wake up, like Ma. No, not like Ma, because Ma is not asleep. So that's a fantastic beginning of the book, which does rather very much set the scene for the whole novel, because in the novel we do have to go through 4 deaths, but each one is very different. And in each one, we hear the random thoughts of the people who are discovering the deaths of their loved ones. And I love the way Galgut brings in those thoughts of, in this case, Amor, who's only 13, realizing that her mother has died, realizing that her aunt has come to get her to tell her that her mother's died, and thinking, no, it hasn't happened. It can't have happened. This thing that she's been waiting for is not a reality. But I also love Damon Galgut's fantastic images, such as when Amor says, it can't be true what her aunt has just told her. Nobody is dead. It's just a word, that's all. She looks at the word lying there on the desk like an insect on its back with no explanation. So the word is lying on the desk. The word death is lying on the desk like an insect on its back. And I think that's a really brilliant image, because death is something impossible to envisage. And it's something that sits there like a grotesque, hideous, ugly concept. An insect lying on its back, its legs in the air, not moving. Something disgusting, horrible, and impossible to believe. And also the very fact that that's just a metaphor, but it seems incredibly real and sits there on the desk vividly, is something that very much is an image that foreshadows events in the rest of the book, because we have various relatives of this family dying, and essentially the novel is set in 4 parts with a funeral in each part. So I was just reading that bit to give you an idea of the brilliance of the language and the way that Galgut actually writes. But now to summarize the book a little bit, um, trying not to give you spoilers for people that haven't read it yet. Do tell me, anyone that's here, if you have read the book or if you haven't, because it would be great to know whether spoilers are allowed. So in part one, which is called Ma, it revolves around the death in 1986 of the matriarch of the family, who's called Rachel. And as we've just heard, Amor, who's the youngest sibling, is staying at a boarding school because she's been shipped there because the family knows that the mother is dying. And Amor returns home to join Astrid, who's the middle sister, and Anton, who's the oldest brother, and he's gone off on military service. And we discover early in the chapter also, so this is not a giveaway, that Anton, on the day before his mother died, he shot a woman randomly because he's doing his military service, and he shot someone who was in a riot. And this woman was about the same age as his mother. And throughout the rest of the book, he feels as if he was responsible for the death of his own mother. He felt like he shot his mother. And he literally says to people as he's on his way home, I shot my mother. And they, at first, think that he actually did. But then they realise that he's kind of raving. And Anton is a very complex character who is deeply troubled and has a lot of promise, which is slowly taken away from him as the book goes on. So getting on to the theme of the promise itself, the promise that's made in the book is made by the father of the family, who promises his black maid that she will one day be given the house that she currently lives in with her son. And this house is on the land of the white family. And the father makes that promise in the hearing of Amor, the 13-year-old girl. And the mother also hears the promise, and she says, before she dies, that Salome, the black maid, must be given the house that she currently lives in. Unfortunately, the family don't keep up their promise, and Salome has to wait for 30 years to see if this promise will be fulfilled. But every chapter of the book feels as if she might actually be given the land at last. But Amor, who's the youngest of the family, is the only one that seems to really care or to have actually believed in the fact that Salome will be given this house that she lives in at the moment. But there are complications, of course, because Salome is a black maid. She's legally not allowed to own the house that she lives in, that she's not allowed to own the property. So that obviously means that the white family have an excuse not to keep up their promise. But then the law changes and Salome would be allowed to be given the property. But by that time, the family are mostly pretending that the promise was never made and saying that Amor is the only person that heard the promise in the first place. So that's the big central premise of the book, that this promise has been made and not kept. And every time that Amor comes back to the family, she tries to make it happen. And various other members of the family also either help or hinder. But there are other aspects of promise in the book too. And one of those is the promise of youth, which is not necessarily fulfilled. So Anton, who's the troubled oldest son of the family, the Swartz family, is full of promise. He's really intelligent. He's very sharp. He's very ironic. He has a very dark sense of humor. And he does seem as if he could do anything at the beginning of the book. But slowly things are taken away from him, partly by his own fault and partly through circumstance. So he does shoot this woman at the start of the book, and that, of course, affects the entire rest of his life. but also he then runs away from military service. And this at the time seems like a symbol of great shame and loss of face. And he has to actually hide and spend the next 18 years not showing his face in most parts of society, which of course has an enormous effect on the way that he perceives himself and the way that he is perceived by people that he knows and by his own family. It turns out that actually running away from military service is seen later on as actually a positive, because the military service that he was running from was one which kept the apartheid laws in place, which of course were later repealed and reviled and seen in a wholly negative light. So Anton's running away from the military service is actually perceived as a heroic thing to do later on. But by then it's too late, and he's actually become an alcoholic and not lived up to the promise that he once had. Similarly, Amor is also a girl of great promise herself, who, well, it's complicated with her because she starts off being described as a bit of a dumpling by her aunt, who perceives her as being something of a placid, flaccid, unemotional child who refuses to enter into her drama. So when her aunt first picks her up at the beginning of the book to tell her that her mother's just died, Amor shows no emotion. And her aunt finds that completely unforgivable because she wants to have a bit of a soap opera drama. She wants tears and misery and wailing, which Amor simply doesn't do. Amor is a very placid seeming child, and she goes home, goes to her mother's funeral, has her period, which causes lots of issues because she gets it literally at the funeral and actually has to leave the funeral in order to go and sort herself out, which of course means that she is really confused and complicated by her feelings about her mother. She feels terrible that she's missing her own mother's funeral, but at the same time she really needs to sort out the fact that she has a period, and it's all the more complicated because it should be her mum which is helping her to sort out her period, but her mother has just died. So Amor has all these terribly conflicting emotions, and she then goes back to the boarding school that she's been sent to while her mother was dying, and she grows up and essentially becomes a bit of a nun-like figure. She goes to work as a nurse eventually with people who have HIV, and she is very much being rather heroic and self-sacrificing. But she also has a period of flourishing into beauty and having, in a way, a promise of potential of other lives that she could have gone into, because suddenly she comes back home when her father is dying years later, and that's another story. And she is suddenly seen as being a beautiful, attractive, seductive woman. And unfortunately, in a way, she doesn't live up to that promise either. She always keeps herself really at the back of things, hiding behind a bushel. And she is the one who really cares about the promise that was made to Salome and whether the family will actually keep that promise. And she, every time that the family come together, which is generally for a funeral, she keeps hitting away at this idea of we've got to do what's right by Salome, but nobody really listens to her. So I won't give away all the plot major moments of drama in the book for people that haven't read it, but it is a rather great scene and rather a wonderful, ironic description of the world of apartheid and the world of South Africa at the time. That the father of the Swartz family, who are the the key family of this book, decides that he will go into a snake pit, which is on this kind of snake theme park that he owns, and he will lock himself into a snake enclosure and break the world record for however long anyone has been in a snake cage without being bitten, in order to raise money for the church that he's a member of. And he is rather coerced into this in a way by the vicar who is in charge of their area. So he is going into it in a slightly foolish way. And he is indeed bitten by a snake and becomes extremely ill and eventually dies. And it's another of the really great scenes in the book, to be honest, when the family is all coming together and talking about why their father was such an idiot as to go into a pit full of snakes, which were all highly poisonous and toxic, inevitably almost to be bitten and to die. And they are really not actually that kind or forgiving of him. But one of the things that I love about the book is the dark humour, which there is a lot of. So I'm not going to go on about this too much longer, because I really think you've got to read it. And it is a book that only comes into its own when you actually read every single sentence, because the sentences are so beautifully written. They're so evocative. Shane, you would definitely love this book. It actually reminds me of a book I read by you in some ways. Shane, you've got to read it. If you haven't looked at it yet, then now is the moment. I really think you'll love it. It is dark, it's funny, and it even has a bit of a road trip in it, which I think you would enjoy. So I'm going to read you a little bit more to give you a bit more of a flavour of its brilliance, because, as I was saying earlier, it's a book that, if I tell you the actual story, it might just sound like it's rather depressing and grim, but when you read it, you'll find it funny, uplifting, tragic, but also in many ways a book that really makes you appreciate life, even though it's so much about death. So I'm reading a bit from slightly nearer to the end, and I do apologise to Instagram watchers this evening. I don't know why my connection is not very good. I'm going to make sure next week that it's better connected. So yes, here's a bit from closer to the end of the book, so I won't really give you much context, but it is when everything is beginning to unravel in the novel, and many people have died in the family. And at this point, the Salome, who's the maid, who was given the promise of being given a house by her white employers, still hasn't been given it, and it's 30 years on. And now we're in the house of Desiree, who is a bit of a nightmare, selfish woman who was married to Anton, who has just died. And Anton is one of the key characters of the family. He's the oldest brother. There's too much sugar in this. I'm always telling you. Sorry, madam. Don't make my bed yet, okay? I might lie down a bit more. I had a terrible night. Sorry, madam. This one has been working here forever, since Anton was born. The things she must have seen and heard. It's because they're always around like ghosts. You almost don't notice them. But it's a mistake to think the same applies in reverse. They're always watching and listening, helping themselves and each other. They know all your secrets, everything about you, even the things other white people don't know. The stains in your underwear, the holes in your socks. You have to get rid of them before they start to scheme. Long past time to let this old one go. Thinking such thoughts, she ambles out with her coffee onto the front stoop. Likes to stand here in the early mornings pretending to be a farmer's wife, while she surfaces into the world. Sometimes she imagines fields of corn rolling away, yellow and green, vibrating in the wind. Out of the corn, that is, the grass, a figure running. The rising sun is a dazzle behind him, and his shadow stretches far ahead, mimicking and mocking. What is it? What's the matter? She can see when he comes in through the open gate that it's only Andil, another one who's been working here forever. Travels in by foot from the township every morning since his family got moved off the farm. Now he's shout-talking at her, telling her what he's seen, back near the electric lines. Oh, God, help me. It's hard to understand. She must have misheard. What? She says. What did you say? But even when the words are repeated, they don't seem attached to the world. No, that can't be true. That doesn't make sense. Only last night that doesn't fit. No. No, she says. But refusal only works on other people. On fate it has no effect. You may have noticed it yourself. Protesting at destiny is a waste of breath. What happens will happen regardless of your no. In the end, it's a fact as neutral as the weather that this morning your husband got up and went outside with his shotgun and contorted himself into an impossible position in order to blow his head off, just because. That's actually a very shocking scene. I'd forgotten quite how shocking it is. But just to comment a little bit more on the brilliance of his writing, I do love the way he talks to you, the reader, quite often. He quite often says, you may have noticed this yourself. And his conversational tone is very seductive because you never quite know who is talking. It's not the author, it's one of his characters. Or is it the author? The narrative viewpoint changes so fluidly that sometimes you're in Desiree, his wife's head. Sometimes you're in Amour, the sister's head. Sometimes you're in a ghost's head. It might be the ghost of their mother. And also, sometimes you're in Damon Galgut's head, perhaps. But I do love the way you never quite know where you are with this narrative voice. Some people would find that frustrating, but despite it being fluid, it does have an amazing sense of clarity to it. So some of the people in my book group this morning were talking about how precise and clear it is to read, even though it has that fluidity, because I think he just captures moments so brilliantly and talks about people's thoughts so brilliantly that you always have a sense of exactly where you are from moment to moment within the narrative. It is a book that makes you concentrate on the page and makes you follow its every move. But that's also why it works so well read aloud by a brilliant reader, which it is on the audio version. And it's brilliant to listen to because you have that great sense of precision, but it's also brilliant to read because you can focus on the page even better. So either way, it's a brilliant read, whether you read it or you listen to it. And I just want to read you a little bit more from even closer to the end, because he also brings in pathetic fallacy with the weather in the book. There's lightning on some of the versions of the cover because one of the main characters, Amour, is struck by lightning when she's age 6. And this is also something that affects her forever and is frequently referred to in the book because that's the moment for her when everything changed in her life. That's the moment when her promise in life changed from one thing to another. And the weather is a very important factor, even though the author talks about the fact that it's random and not created by God or created by poetic laws. And all these aspects of the book are ones that make you realise that the author has thought about everything that he's writing in an amazing amount of depth. And he is self-referentially referring to the act of writing itself it's a very postmodern novel in that sense. So I'll just read you this little bit. After he went to jail the first time, he was never the same. There's a hot wind gusting now and black clouds rolling in from the east, thunder gargling away in the black throat of the sky. Time to get moving and to use haste to cover what would otherwise crack the heart. Both women know they won't see each other again. But why does it matter? They're close, but not close, joined, but not joined. One of the strange, simple fusions that hold this country together, sometimes only barely. They embrace a last time. Frail basket of bones containing its fire, pulse beating dimly under your hand. Goodbye, Salome. Thank you. Goodbye, Amor, and thank you. Then it's done and you're walking away in every sense, leaving it behind. Crying, of course, stinging salt tears, through which the copy looms and wavers. She has a sudden mad impulse to go over it instead of around. But is there time? The storm is blowing in and the air crackles. Lightning doesn't strike the same place twice, except when it does. What a way to go. Before she knows it, halfway up the hill, her body thinks it's still young and leaps at it, but she's soon panting and perspiring, not dressed for it either in these shoes, used to ascending from the other side, no path here to see. Even my feet have habits, but in the end you arrive at the same place, which isn't the same anymore. What's changed, Amor? Not the black branches, or the rocks, nor the view very much. No, it's you that's changed, the eyes you look through. None of it appears the way it used to, the scale or the dread. This epic vista is quite small, really. Just a place where something happened to you. And one you should leave soon if you don't want it to happen again. All the lines in the world are leaning in one direction away from what's coming. Those clouds are mean and giving off sparks. So I won't read on because I don't want to give it all away. But hi, Tracy, great to see you. If you've only just joined, I'm talking about The Promise by Damon Galgut, which just won the Booker Prize 2021. And it is a fantastic book all about South Africa and apartheid and broken promises. And I would say it's an absolutely must read. One to savour, take slowly, not to leap into lightly, because it is one that's kind of a demanding read. It's not the most relaxing read, but it is one that's full of humour, sadness, tragedy, and joy. And actually, oh, I've suddenly just made myself disappear. There we go. It's one which, despite having a lot of death and sadness in it, takes you on a journey which leaves you feeling positive and uplifted, weirdly enough. So I would love any of you to read it and get back to me and tell me what you think. When we were talking about it in our book group this morning, one of the members commented that it sounds like a book that you can just dip into at any point and find an amazing passage, which is true. But she thought that it meant that you could kind of almost read it randomly and it wouldn't really matter where you start reading. But that's not the case. You do really need to go on the journey through the book from beginning to end, because although it's a book that goes back and forth in time to some extent, it does actually have a very strong narrative arc, and it takes you through many different family dramas. And the main character, who is Amor, she's there at the beginning, she's there at the end, and it's her life that we experience most fully. And through her, we achieve catharsis. So, The Promise, this is one you've got to read. Now, I did start thinking, because of the idea of the promise, about promises in literature. And I know there must be hundreds of books which have the central theme of a promise that is kept or broken or attempted to be kept and failed. And I'd love it if you have any thoughts on such books that you could share with me. Please do send me messages if so. because it's actually something I was trying to research for this evening and not finding that many helpful suggestions. However, there is one which I would love to talk about briefly, which is The Harpy by Megan Hunter, which, as you can see, it's quite a wonderful cover, which has a bit of a kind of metamorphosis vibe and the idea of something rather mythical going on. And the reason that it came to mind in terms of thinking about promises in literature is because it's about a marriage in which one of the central promises of the marriage is broken, is not kept. So, in brief, the idea of the book and the story is that in this married couple, the husband, who's called Jake, is suddenly discovered to have been having an affair. So Lucy, the wife, lives happily with her husband and two boys in a town in England, which I think is based on Cambridge, and they have a sort of pleasant suburban life. But then one afternoon, a man calls saying that his wife has been having an affair with Jake, Lucy's husband. And Lucy is distraught, but she has very young boys, and she wants to stay with them and stay as a family for their sake. But in order to even the score with her husband, who's been unfaithful, she decides to hurt him 3 times. And this is where it takes on slightly mythical fairy tale qualities, that she is going to find a way of hurting him in 3 different ways, which she says to him will be unpredicted and unexpected and come out of the blue. And her vengeance is actually pretty shocking. And she becomes a harpy, effectively, in order to get her vengeance on her husband. And it's quite a bizarre and brilliant book, which I did very much enjoy, I must say. It's quite a short novel, very tightly written, and very much unexpected. When you're reading it, you really don't know where it's going. So I don't want to give away too much, but it actually made me think of book club review podcast. Glad to see you're liking the idea of it. I think you would love it. It made me think about Gawain and the Green Knight, the 13th century poem, because in that book it's all about vengeance, it's all about tit for tat. So the Green Knight has his head cut off at the beginning of the book, and he tells Gawain that Gawain's got to come back a year later and have his head cut off too. And in the meantime, without going into too much depth into that story, Gawain does 3 bad things effectively, and his honor is besmirched 3 times, and he therefore has to have 3 attacks on his person, which are physical, spiritual, and mental. And this book is very much doing the same kind of thing. Lucy, the heroine, decides to attack her husband 3 times in different ways, and it's pretty crazy what she does, but also weirdly believable. She's not a psycho, just so you know. It's not a book about murder, but she does take on slightly mythical values as the book goes on. I will read you a little section of it so that you can get a sense of her writing, but I do think that many of you would really enjoy this novel. Here we go. This is from the beginning. It is the last time. He lies down, a warm night, his shirt pulled up, his head turned away. It's the kind of evening that used to make me want to fly through the sky, the kind that makes you believe it will never get dark. Neighbours are having barbecues. The smell of the meat, sweet and homely, moves across his face. Downstairs, our children are in their beds, dreaming through the hours, their doors closed, the late light blocked by their curtains. We've agreed on a small neck, his upper thigh, a place that will be behind jeans, under shirts, a place of thick flesh, solid bone, almost no hair, a smooth place, waiting. Jake is not squeamish. He's like a man expecting a tattoo. His hair is getting long, curling over the nape of his neck. His eyes are closed, not screwed shut, just closed, like a skillful child pretending to be asleep. So that's the very start of the book. And I do find it's a really odd mixture of that kind of simmering violence and the domestic. It's very much a book about being a wife, being a mum, being someone stuck at home, a bit fed up and bored, and going through domestic drudgery. Also, being someone who is attempting to work at home and freelancing. So many women, mothers, wives, and men too will very much relate to the book, I think, and be really curious about where it goes and why Lucy decides to keep her promise to her husband when he broke his. So that's a book about a broken promise, The Harpy by Megan Hunter. And it came to mind because I was thinking about promises in literature. But do tell me if you have any thoughts about promises in literature. I'd love to know if any stories come to mind which aren't fairy tales, because I think there's quite a lot of fairy tales which have promises, but I'd love to know modern novels or novels of the last couple of 100 years. So I'm going to end on that note, but I'd just like to say I will be back next week. I'm going to start at an earlier time of 8 o'clock because I've been invited out after my event and to a birthday party. So I'm going to do my bibliotherapy live at 8 till 9, and I will very likely be continuing on the theme of the Booker Prize shortlist, and I'm going to try and talk about all the other contenders next week if I can get hold of all the books. Otherwise I might just do 2 or 3. Also, if anyone's in the Sussex area on Sunday, do come to Hurstpierpoint, where we're going to be having a street fair with wonderful Christmas stalls, food, mulled wine, and bibliotherapy. I'm going to be doing bibliotherapy in a special bibliotherapy van, which I'm very excited to welcome people into. And there's going to be all sorts of wonderful things on sale in the Hurst Village Fair. So that's Sunday, 12 till 6. And maybe see you there for local listeners and people who are further afield, such as Tracy, lovely to see you here this evening, and Shane, who I know doesn't live so nearby either. I know lots of you are actually far away. Nat Neo, Cyberflanners, great to see you all this evening. Thanks so much for coming, and either see you Sunday on our high street or see you next week at 8 p.m, slightly earlier time. And thanks for joining me tonight. Enjoy the books. Good night. See you soon.